Okay.
Up for everyone joining online. I think it'll be just a few minutes before we get things going here. Thanks for your patience while we allow people to gather in the room. Thank you.
There are 41 people online.
Oh, that's a lot. Okay, good. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I suggest that we sit down and we start the session.
And share your screen. There is no special permission to be granted.
Okay.
In case you want to call Maria on,
Yeah.
I will let her know that she can start.
All right. Good. Yes. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us here today, both in person and online. We have a nice group online as well, and it's a pleasure to see you here for this panel on land governance titled Tenure Security for All, a case for local and global action to advance the implementation of the voluntary guidelines on land tenure. So before I introduce myself, I would like to let you know that we have interpretation in French and Spanish. So for those of you in the room, you can use the headphones available. And for people online, you can click on the globe icon at the lower part of your Zoom window. So that's for the practicalities. My name is Gemma Betsma. I'm a senior program advisor for the Land at Scale program, which is the main Dutch government land governance program. And I'm also currently together with Chantal, the chair for the Global Donor Working Group on Land. Well, it's in that capacity that I'm happy to be your chair today. And this event is co-organized by quite a number of organizations, so I'll briefly mention them. It's FAO, FCDO, International Land Coalition, the Struggles for Land Forum, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, TMG Research, the Land Portal Foundation, and RVO. So we have a wide and diverse group here at the table, and we're looking forward to having a good discussion with you all. To briefly introduce the session, as we are all aware, escalating pressure on food systems and land use, climate change, and eroding respect for human rights have led to a deepening global crisis in the recognition and protection of land tenure. Which are essential for food security, for livelihoods of millions of people, but also for protecting human rights, for achieving gender equality, for working on climate action, and so forth. So we're really seeing land governance as a crucial foundation for achieving basically all of the SDGs. However, if we look at progress towards the land tenure indicator of the SDGs, target 1.4, on equal rights to ownership and control over land and other resources, we see that things are off track with that indicator as well as with other land-related indicators. In 2012, the CFS endorsed the voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure of land, fisheries and forests, or VGGT in short, and it provides a good global framework for working on land governance. But when we look now in 2023 at the half-point mark of the SDGs, we see that urgent and coordinated global action is in fact needed to advance this agenda and to mobilize political action and to invest more to achieve tenure security. We're here to say the VGGT need to be put firmly back on the agenda to advance tenure rights. And that's why we have come here together today to present and discuss the case for more coordinated global and local action to advance tenure rights. And those of you in the room who may now think that I have heard that term land tenure one too many times, this is not my topic, please stay, because this session is also very much meant to show that land tenure is interacting with a lot of other topics and is very much part of achieving the different development goals. Good, so, oh yeah, I have a few more logistical notes. For those of you joining online, please also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We will have a Q&A session towards the end. For those participating online, you can also use the chat to post your questions for this session. And I have to mention that live tweeting is occurring for this event with the hashtag #LandAgenda. So please join in on that as well. So I'll introduce the panelists sitting here next to me. First, Bart Anshu will be the first one to speak. He's recently appointed land tenure lead here at FAO in Rome. Bart served as a senior technical specialist at the International Land Coalition prior, and where he was seconded from the Agricultural Research Center for International Development, CIRAD. Next to Chris, next to Bart, we have Chris, already giving the name. So Senior Land Policy Lead for FCDO of the United Kingdom. Chris is Agriculture and Rural Development Specialist with more than 20 years of experience in smallholder agriculture, market development, and natural resource management. We have Annette joining us online, Annette Mbogo. She is the Executive Director of the Kitua Shaasheria Legal Advice Center. And Annette has been an advocate for the High Court of Kenya for more than 15 years. Annette also serves as the chair of the Land, State and Non-State Actors Network in Kenya. Welcome also, Annette, online. Nice to see you. Then we have Ramesh, also sitting here at the table. Ramesh Sharma is the National Coordinator of ACTA Parishat, a mass-based people's movement for land rights with active membership of 250,000 landless poor. So today he is representing the Struggles for Land Forum, which unites major farmer organizations from 4 continents. And then last but not least, Laura, sitting next to me, Laura Medjolaro is the Managing Director of the Land Portal, and she's a specialist in communication, information and knowledge management for development with a passion for open data. And she has 18 years of experience working on these topics, focused on land rights. So I'm going to ask the panelists to please keep within time so that we do have some room for questions and discussion. We have a relatively short session and we have a lot of interesting speakers, so please try and, bear with me for that. And let me first give the floor to Ward to share, some context for this session and explain why do we need this coordinated action in the context of achieving tenure security for all. Ward.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma. So as Gemma said, the objective of my very short introduction here is to convince the audience of the importance of working on land. But if I look around here, I think I know everybody in this room, and so my task here will be relatively simple. Hopefully, online there's more people and people that are not directly related to the land sector, and that we would like to pull in our work on land, so that land reaches beyond its traditional boundaries. I had a little PowerPoint, so I don't know how this works. Yeah, the last one, perfect. So you can go to the second slide. So I will be very short. I think Chris and our other colleagues here have more important things on the content of what we want to do. I just wanted to give you two short messages to convince you of the relevance of this work and of the need to upscale the work we are doing on land. And the first one, on the second slide, is that land and tenure security are central. Okay, perfect. Thanks. Are central. Of course, we know that it is important for those who live on and who live from the land, first and foremost for their cultural, family, and personal ties. But it's also important for their livelihoods, for their socio-economic well-being, etc., etc. But land is also central, and land and tenure security is also central to so many other things. It's central to peace, it's central to democracy, it's central to climate and nature, it's central to economic growth. Not addressing land might jeopardize addressing these other global challenges. Addressing land is not a solution to address these challenges, but not addressing it will make addressing these global challenges, the other global challenges, much more tricky. Yet, and I'll just want to give you a couple of killer facts here. Worldwide, still, after having taken conscious of the centrality of land, nowadays, nearly 1 billion people are considered likely to be evicted from their lands in the 5 next years. As we all know, women constitute less than 50% of the world landholders. Coming to indigenous peoples and local communities, estimates say that they hold or occupy or own between 30 and 50% of the world's lands. However, legal ownership to these rights have only been recognized on 10% of these lands. Going to the other side, to the bigger farms, 1% of the world's farms, those big farms that we know, operate and control more than 70% of the world's farmland. The smaller farms, 84% of them, are operating only 12% of the world's lands, resulting in huge inequalities and, of course, prosperity inequalities for those that are squeezed in these 12%. Lastly, very importantly, is for those who are defending the rights of land and the smallholders, is that 2/3 of all human rights defenders killed in 2020 were working on land, were working on defending environmental and indigenous people's rights. So you've understood my message here. We need to do more, and we need to do urgently. Not addressing tenure security is having consequences for those who live on the land, but you've understood it because of the centrality of land. It is affecting all of us. Hence, it's important to work on it quickly, and it's important to work on it collaboratively with these other sectors, whether it's climate, peace, democracy, etc., because of the centrality of land. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart, and well, thank you for setting the scene for us on why land matters and what the problem is that we are facing. The next speakers are gonna highlight some of the ways in which we are trying to advance this agenda in different ways. So let me go to Chris, who will introduce the Global Land Agenda and Framework for Action. So please go ahead, Chris.
Thank you very much, Gemma. And great that you all made it Friday afternoon, and all those who are online. So Ward has sort of set out the importance of land and the scale of the challenge, really, to secure tenure rights for all, to recognize and protect all legitimate tenure rights. And what I'm going to talk about is, before my other colleagues, is one one particular initiative to try and address this. And I want to sort of set out where this has come from and what we're trying to do. I want to say right at the beginning that this is such a big challenge, everyone needs to get involved in this, right? And so we need lots of different actions at different levels. My one plea, what I'm trying to communicate, is that the more coordinated we can be, the more we can join forces in trying to get this message across, I think the more powerful and effective we will be. So what needs to change? And I've identified three sort of big intermediate steps in a way. One is clearly we want to get land and tenure security and access to land up the global agenda. I'm not necessarily suggesting at the UN Security Council, or at the General Assembly rather, but that would be great. But land has made its way progressively into some of the big Rio Convention discussions, and that's very welcome. But I still think we've got some way to go where there's a true recognition of the scale of the crisis, the level of funding required, climate finance and other, and the political will that needs to be mobilized at the country level to make that a reality. So political will, I think, is the second really important issue. One reason why we're probably not making enough progress in many countries is that land reform and whatever the required steps are often contested, and so there's a lot of different players that need to be mobilized to make it happen. And then the third area is financing. Tenure reform, recognition of all legitimate tenure rights does cost money, and money isn't the only issue, but it's an important part as well. And so we need to think about how can we mobilize more resources at all levels to support communities and their bottom-up efforts, if you will, to protect their rights, but also to support national level reforms in line with the VGGT. And I should have made that point at the beginning. We're not talking about any reforms. We're talking about reforms in line with the key principles in the voluntary guidance on the governance of tenure. So how do we bring this about? How does change happen? I guess all of us in our roles are often asking this question: how does change happen? A few years ago, a number of us, a mixture of some donors, civil society organizations, colleagues from some of the multilateral agencies, got together to say, we know we are off track against the SDG target on land, even if the data isn't great, but we're fairly confident that we're not really going to get there by 2030. What can we do? We looked at some other successful movements in other sectors to say, can we learn from them about how they mobilized, how they organized, how they got this up the global agenda, how they raised funding? And one of them, but not the only one, was the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. But there are some really good other examples from other sectors, gender and climate as well. And we identified, actually not just these 6, but a number of different sort of ingredients, if you will, or building blocks about how you mobilize global momentum, attention, funding, political action. So these 6, just briefly, and this is not a sort of exhaustive list. One was really that in these other sectors, they were able to mobilize a coalition of stakeholders across different stakeholder groups. So it wasn't just civil society. It certainly was not donors only. It wasn't multilateral. It was somehow bringing together actors across different stakeholder groups to work together. I think in many cases they were able to develop a very clear and compelling narrative or message. And I think that's really important, because when we're trying to speak to global leaders, often our language is quite technical, quite complicated. So we have to simplify it, which many of us don't like, because we know how complex it is and how we need to say everything to be accurate. But I think that's another thing that some of these other movements have done very successfully. The third one was mobilizing high-level political champions, again, from governments, from international organizations who are willing to champion this. I think that's really important. A fourth one was some kind of framework for action. So that's clear what the movement is really asking for. What is it that we want others to do? What are the key interventions that need to happen? I think many of them, point 5, have had some kind of accountability process on an annual or biannual basis, where they have data on how individual member states, if you will, are performing against their own commitments, and where there's a way to track that and hold everyone to account. And then last one, I've called this political forcing moments, which is maybe a little bit confusing, but what I mean is, I think it's really, most of them have had some kind of summit, some kind of moment where you bring political leaders together and where they are put under some kind of pressure or have incentives to make commitments. And I don't think this alone ever changes the world. All of us have been to high-level events where we wondered afterwards what it really achieved. But I think something like that can definitely help in mobilizing and encouraging countries to really think about this, to take it seriously, to make commitments, and then to hold them to account. Okay, I think this is almost my last slide. No, one more to go after this. So how have we drawn on this sort of learning to think about something that we have called the Global Land Agenda, which is kind of a way to describe a global campaign that we are hoping to mobilize. And I've just tried to sort of translate some of these points into different elements. Some of these are already happening. Some of them are things that we would like to work towards. We already have a sort of very loose coalition of organizations who've been part of this process over the last 2 years. Again, from all different stakeholder groups. And we're keen to expand that and bring others on board. We have a draft framework for action, which probably still needs a bit more work. And that's I think it's on the ILC website. I'm looking at Ward, or used to be, still is maybe. So that's something that we want to develop and refine further. I think we've begun to build on this, and not just us. I mean, this is really about everyone mobilizing in different ways, whether they're part of this particular initiative or not, to try and get land more into some of the big global processes like UNFCCC and the different COPs, CBD as well, and G20. And maybe with Brazil hosting the G20 next year, there might be some other opportunities.
Chris, are you finally?
I'm wrapping up, sorry, I'm going on a bit too long here. So there is a Global Land Observatory many of you will be familiar with, and if not, you can ask Ward or others afterwards, which is trying to get better data or bring data together and report on it. We had a really good meeting on Monday with a number of governments who I think could become maybe political sort of champions for this initiative. And we're thinking about how could we work towards some kind of summit, either for land or piggybacking on other high-level events to kind of make commitments. So how do we go from these ideas to action and build a movement? I think the main thing is that we really focus less on structure and how we organize ourselves, and really think what is it that we want to achieve, and recognizing that there will be a range of different ways of getting there and different initiatives, different tracks. But we need sort of more collaborators, more voices. We definitely need more resources to make this happen, which is an appeal to donors like FCDO and others. And then we need to really start trying to campaign and take these messages, if we can come up with some unified ones, to different events. Francisco Carranza over here has been the coordinator sort of this informal group the last few months, and hopefully carrying on. So if you would like to find out more about this initiative, how you could join, we're still trying to work out what the next step is and how we move this forward, but do get in touch with Francisco. The email is there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris. Yes. And thank you for introducing this global initiative to increase attention and political commitment to land. I think we are gonna turn now to Dr. Mbogo, who's joining us online, who's gonna talk about more national level action to advance this agenda. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Annette Bogo. I'm the Executive Director of a national organization called Kituo cha Sheria, but I also chair the Land Sector and State Actors Network. That is a collaborative network that brings together over 80 non-state actors within Kenya. So I think I'd start first by saying that the VGGT is a very good guideline in terms of adopting human rights standards and principles. And because of that, we see that state parties have an obligation to respect, to protect, and to promote and fulfill land-related rights, and from a human rights perspective. So our organization, together with the Land Sector and State Actors Network, partnered with the Danish Institute to conduct a human rights assessment of land governance, which was done at both national and local level. And we used a tool that was developed by the Danish Institute, the Human Rights for Land Governance tool, that was actually collaboratively developed by TMG, the Danish Institute, and Malawi Human Rights Commission. And the tool was very useful because it looks at several different thematic areas anchored within the VGGT, and it enabled us as land statements, as LSNSA, to be able to assess the extent to which the Kenyan government was complying with human rights standards in relation to land tenure, as well as access to land rights within not just the national context, but also within the local context. And why this was very important is because under our constitution, specifically Article 2, 5, and 6 of our constitution, Kenya adopts, by virtue of ratification, all human rights instruments, and they become part of our national law. So all the human rights instruments that touch on land that Kenya has ratified, most of which are incorporated within the VGGT, really impose some human rights obligations that we thought is particularly essential for Kenya to comply with. So in terms of our process, this was a collaborative process, and each member of the network has a specific niche within matters relating to land, and hence we all worked within specific areas, and having been actively involved in land governance at community level and at national level, we found that using the tool was particularly helpful to enable us to see to what extent is our Kenya government complying with these human rights standards. And not just to look at it from the perspective of legislative and policy framework, but also see how this translates to actual actions on the ground, and especially at a local level. So the assessment was done nationally and also was done locally by a community-based organization that's called CPAF. And just to see the comparisons was particularly interesting because there were several gaps in terms of looking at, from a national perspective, the really beautiful legislative frameworks that we have. But then when you come to the ground, it's a totally different story. So one of the issues that I think I'd like to point out that revealed these particular gaps was the question of evictions, forced evictions without compensation and without consultation. And we found that our legislation is very clear on eviction being done in a humane manner, but also that communities that have to be evicted or moved from their homes need to be consulted and also need to be provided with alternative settlement. So that was the obligation under national law, also under international law. But when it came to local scenarios, we found that still so many communities are still facing that threat of eviction. And in many instances, even just in the recent past, we've seen a number of people being forcefully evicted without notice and also without consultation and without compensation. So the kind of disparity between what we have in terms of legal obligations and what actually happens at the ground was very clear. The other issue relates to land tenure, especially when it comes to women. So the law is very clear that everyone has a right to own land, own property, have access to land. But then when it came to the local assessment of this, we found that very few women have actual ownership of land, and they only access land through male relatives, their husbands, their uncles, their brothers, or their fathers. So we find that that particular legal or policy framework is not being complied with at local level, despite there being a clear obligation both at national and at international level. So in terms of what we have found that we intend to do after this assessment is to use this as a basis first for advocacy, sharing it with the state actors so that they may see where we are at, because we find there's a huge data gap, especially when it comes to questions relating to land tenure and land management in general. And so we find that we'll be using the outcome of this assessment to point out to local governments as well as national governments on the gaps that they need to work on, and do this from a point of evidence so that they don't just dismiss us as being civil society actors who just want to cause trouble. The other issue also is on policy review. So Kenya is at the point where we are about to review our national land policy. Obviously, in terms of reviewing of the policy, there's a need to look back and see to what extent have we complied with, have we implemented the policy, where are the gaps, what needs to be emphasized, and also what are the emerging issues that the new policy would need to address. And so we intend to use the outcome of the assessment to inform the policy review process, and a number of the members of the land sector and state actors network are actually directly involved in the committee that will be reviewing our national land policy, as well as leading in terms of public participation on various issues relating to land. So I think in a nutshell, just to say that the importance of having this tool was also to track and monitor as civil society actors in terms of where should our programming focus on, and also where would we want to put emphasis on in terms of fundraising for resources for the work that we do, and also to build community power so that the communities themselves are able to push for reform in line with the human rights obligations that the state has. So thank you very much for having me. I think that's all I have to say right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Annette. And I think this was a really nice addition to what we've heard so far, to really bringing in some country experiences of how, well, this agenda is also being advanced at the country level. So that was really interesting. And the link, I think, to the tool has been shared in the chat. So if anyone is interested, can be found there. All right, so we go to our next speaker. Let's see who's going to be the next. It's going to be Ramesh, it's you. I can't find it on my paper, but it's going to be you.
Thank you.
And you're going to talk to us about what's happening in India in advancing the land agenda, but also at the international level.
Definitely.
So,
yeah, thanks,
please
Chair.
go ahead.
So, friends, I mean, in my presentation, I just only want to put 4 points, 4 very specific points. But before saying that, I mean, we need to reimagine and re-energizing the land and agrarian reforms, which is largely remains as an unfinished agenda, especially in the global south. So my first point is to think about the structural and institutional inability to recognize the growing landlessness and homelessness, and especially in the context of indigenous peoples, nomads, fisher folks, pastoral communities, single women, etc. So largely the global south is actually inherit the colonial legacy of the land legislations, which are like institution-centric, where the institutions have given a more power and which are largely failed to address the generational question of agrarian and land reforms. As a result, millions of landless and homeless poor and the marginal communities are waiting for the land rights since 3, 4, or 5 generations, which is a real shame for all of us. So the message here, it's rather saying no one left behind, which is, of course, is a very good slogan. We need to speak, let's act now to complete the unfinished agenda of land and agrarian reforms. My second point is let's start thinking to... No, I don't have slides, thank you. Yeah. So my second point is let's start thinking about reconfigure the political potential to secure the land rights to the women. As previous speakers said, and I fully agree, that we need to understand a framework which actually legally recognizes the women land rights and recognize the women as a farmer. So the political inertia on gender justice is responsible for pushing almost half of the world's population of women in the state of inequality and historically discriminated since centuries. The larger agenda of women land rights cannot be excused by accusing social resistance. Rather, international institutions and the state governments need to accept the fact that without recognizing the women as a landowner and women as a farmer, any agenda of gender justice and gender equality is just remain an eyewash. So the message is very clear here, especially considering the voluntary guideline on land tenure and the SDG goal 5 and target 5.1.1 to evolve a very robust legal framework to enable the women farmers for strengthening the family farming. And all of us, we know that the family farming is a key to ending the inequality and hunger in the world. My third point is recognizing the land and agrarian reform as a community-based answer against the climate crisis and hunger. We are well aware of growing rural population witnessing the climate crisis, which are affecting a large number of people and their livelihood. The serious absence of land reforms policy has been taken as a political excuse to acquire and transfer large chunk of fertile land and the rich forest in the name of infrastructural development by making thousands of farmers landless poor. I mean, in my opinion and in my understanding, in this unequal world, the number of farmers who lost the land are definitely more in numbers as compared to the number of landless poor who received the land in the recent past, which is a main concern for all of us today. So the message here that we need to understand and to evolve a community-based land, forest, and water governance systems, which actually VGGT and SDG is talking about, as a realistic and sustainable solution to counter the adverse impact of climate crisis and protect the people and the livelihood. And specifically in the case of India, we take the Forest Rights Act as a one historical example, how with the Forest Rights Act, more than 2 million people, they have received the land, and now they have control over their communitarian land as well as the forest. And this is a one very potential area. My fourth and final point is the building and strengthening the alliances of land and farmers movement. Being a member of Forum for the Land Struggle, which is a global platform, and we have members who represented the Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe, we understood that this has actually evolved over the years, along with the global events in 2006, 2016, and now we are planning for the next global event in 2026, hopefully in Africa. So our aim is to amplify the voices of the poor people, the landless, for land and agrarian reforms. So our message here is to encourage the proposed ministerial forum on land reforms to understand, to recognize, to accept and start acting on better framework and think to go beyond the VGGT and SDG. So, and addressing the unfinished agenda of land reforms. And my final message here, that this is the high time for us to need to recognize the constructive oppositional space of land rights movements and the farmers movement, and respect the voices of the position of the land rights activists per se. Because even after a progressive land reforms agenda, we definitely need to enable and empower the land rights movement, and especially to strengthen the voices of the people who are facing the landlessness in the ground. So this is my final message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh, for that powerful message and for highlighting in specific also the challenges of landless people, of women, as well as the strength of the community-based governance system in addressing climate crisis. So finally, Laura, I think almost all of the presenters have at least mentioned at some point data and the importance of open information. So yeah, you're gonna tell us a bit more about that. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you, and I'm very pleased to sit here with this great panel and to try to make the case, no, to contribute to this global land agenda. I believe that the perspective that I want to bring to the table is how land data can inform and support this process and these efforts of promoting and get traction for a global land agenda. At the Land Portal Foundation, we do believe that land data, land information, either at the local level, the national level, or the global level, must be more open than they currently are to really enable coordinated global effort to get traction and inform, a global land agenda. So, let me see if it works. Yeah, works. So I also have 4 points, like my colleague here, that I want to make. So access to information, or ATI, is a fundamental right, and it is also a human right. So is also not only is a fundamental right, but is an enabler of other key rights or services, such as food, water, sanitation. And from our perspective, access to information law are also important preconditions, first steps towards establishing good, strong national land data governance and more open land data infrastructure. All of know how transformative can be this legislation can be in accessing and enabling citizen participation, improving transparency, counteracting corruption, but also opening great economic opportunities in the countries where these rights is really effectively implemented. So what we have seen in recent years is, despite the great amount of data and information on land, who has grown really exponentially due to the momentum of the SDGs, but also new technologies that allow us to collect data at a speed and at a rate that was not possible before. Data availability doesn't necessarily translate into increased accessibility to data or increased use or accountability. And this is because the land sector, and you can see from the slide here, is still struggling to make land data available as a public good. And land data systematically ranks lowest on the Global Data Barometer, on the Global Data Index, that year after year keep measuring it compared to other data type or other sectors. So the second point is what what is the situation of access to land data and information? There are also some positive signs. As I said, access to information is a core target in the Sustainable Development Goals. In Africa, for instance, where the Land Portal has conducted some research in 15 countries, we have seen that ATI is recognized under the African Charter on Human People Rights. The African Union has also drafted a model law on access to information to guide member countries in adopting legal frameworks. Now, 50% of countries in Africa have enacted ATI's legislations, and 8 more countries are in the process of doing so, and are also working on other aspects of data protection and privacy and security. So there is some work being done there. We also look very positively as a positive example at the Open Government Partnership as an example of collaboration. Is a platform where government and civil society co-create 2-year action plans with very concrete commitments that they try to implement. And a number of members have been more ambitious, particularly about land issues, with a great number of commitments being formulated among OGP members. So these are just positive examples, of course not enough, but just to keep us positive, constructive, and optimistic. But how can the land data, open land data, meaningfully contribute to the global land agenda? How can we be pragmatic? It's a huge undertaking, it's a huge challenge, and very ambitious. How can we make the case for more democratic information ecosystems that really don't amplify the existing power imbalances? Well, a key pillar of the third wave of open data places more emphasis on the fact that the use of data is what matters, and therefore data should be open for a specific purpose. And again, opening data comes with a huge cost, and a huge technical, human capacity, financial implications. And therefore, the idea of data commons and data collaboratives as a possible model to accelerate access and sharing and use of data for a public good have started to take shape. And the principle behind these approaches include collaboration, again, with different group of stakeholders in developing common standards, and also a critical mass of interoperable data that attract opportunities and can focus on solving specific problems. So I can give a few examples of what the Land Portal has tried to do to implement these collaborative data sharing actions, with the hope of be pragmatic, but also encourage collaborations with the data stakeholders. One example is, for instance, the Open Up Guide on Land Governance. Yeah, the Open Up Guide on Land Governance, which is the attempt to come to a framework, a roadmap together in collaboration with local or national government for the implementation of fair principles or more open data practices in their information systems. So the focus here is empowering, increasing awareness of governments, but also empowering them as in their role as the main custodians of land data, and ensuring that they provide data for the public good for their citizens in a sustainable and ongoing way. There's also a good example with a completely different community. We created a global project database, which is a highly curated database on land projects, developing close collaboration with the donor community, because it's also important to understand, where land interventions have evolved over the years, and funding have been invested, and where, and on what, and also in collaboration with the IATI Secretariat. IATI is a recognized standard on aid data that most donor agencies already use. And here the goal is making project data interoperable and discoverable for a specific for everyone, but that a specific community can use to improve decision making and planning. Landvoc is also a nice effort of creating, implementing semantic intelligence to develop a standard, a control vocabulary that helps advance the use of metadata and standards to make data and information more discoverable. And here again, has been implemented over 10 years with the collaboration of so many groups of stakeholders who contributed terms, concepts, translations. So really a great effort. So to conclude, we believe that the growing demand for digital data requires increasingly sophisticated technologies, capacity, but the support and the of different really group of data stakeholders. This means developing targeted, but also support and encourage collaborative approaches. So to really improve benchmarking, to improve data sharing, to improve data use. So this requires, of course, investment and in more data systems and infrastructures, which we believe is a precondition to really implement a global land agenda. So just to a last point, we also believe that talking about data is important, and talking about data in a very inclusive way with different groups that have different perspectives, because data is so different and represent different stakes. But it's very important to make this conversation about data inclusive and yeah, participatory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, thank you for also underlining indeed the role and the importance of data in all of what we've been talking about until now. Yeah, so compliments to the speakers, because they have been keeping great time. I, on the other hand, started the session 5 minutes late, so but we've managed to catch up on some time. So maybe good to mention that Annette had to leave, I think, a little bit earlier. She's still there. Anyway, there's also a colleague of Annette of the Danish Institute for Human Rights who could also answer questions for Annette, so I wanted to mention that. I'm not sure if we have any questions here in the room for now. Any of the speakers or for different speakers? Yes, I see a hand there. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself briefly? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Natasha, and I support the International Land Coalition's work with pastoralists and on rangelands. And my question really is, I feel compelled to raise concerns from our pastoralist members that continue to feel very excluded in their struggle for land rights, not only by states and governments, who in many cases continue to see them as backward, unproductive, damaging, threatening, even occupying lands that are now considered, open, barren, waste, but also actually feeling excluded from conversations with development practitioners, donors, and other actors, partially because of the complexities of their tenure systems, what with shared resource use and mobility and such. Of course, the VGGT Technical Guide 6 forms a very strong and compelling basis for securing tenure for pastoralists and does pay attention to these specificities that lends the adaptive capacity for pastoralists to provide for people and nature. But still, if you see the implementation, we already know that the figures for, farmers, indigenous peoples, and all of these are poor, but pastoralists will still figure even lower. And so really I'm compelled to ask, especially to donor agencies and other big actors, what their interest in supporting the pastoral land tenure agenda might be. Thank you.
So you're adding to this agenda as well pastoralist challenges, and not to forget about that. Do you want any one of the panel to respond to that specifically? Yeah? Okay. Yes, please go ahead. Oh, who was first? No? Yeah, you go.
So, hi, my name is Jorge Rincon. I work at FAO, but I've studied for more than 10 years land policy issues during my studies, PhD, and so on. And the point of land reform was raised, and it's great to have that point again on the agenda. But something that I've constantly seen in the studies I've done is that how this land reform is done is very important, so that those beneficiaries of land reform do not face risks that may end up increasing inequality after the risks that they're going to have because of, I don't know, prices, climate, conflict, and so on. How do you imagine, or do you consider is the proper way to foster this process of land reform for governments, but so that if you transfer property rights, that this process doesn't end up like increasing inequality as a mean to mitigate the consequences of negative shocks that beneficiaries may end up having. And as well, maybe related to Laura, if I'm not wrong, regarding data, like, do you consider maybe the best option to increase this data is improving cadastral data, making boundaries, and so on? There's this question of, do we specify clear boundaries for land tenure security, but then once we have boundaries, then we really have no word to say like what happens out of those boundaries? Is that the proper, like, I'm just thinking like in cadastral data for a community, collective titles, for instance, you say, okay, for this community, this specific boundary, but then you lose the right to say whatever happens out of your collective title, for instance. Is
You speak closer to the mic.
yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
Sorry. Regarding data, you were mentioning data. If you, I was thinking of cadastral data. If governments invest on that, and then you clarify, for instance, in collective titles, or doesn't need to be collective titles, but something similar for at individual level or collective level. If you specify a boundary for a community or for a person, you lose the right to say what happens out of this area. Is how do you manage that? How do you manage that risk that you cannot say anything what happens out of your property? There might be, I don't know, mining, there might be a huge plantation, whatever, but you lose the right to say what happens out of your property. So how to control for that? Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm also briefly turning to Francisco, who's keeping an eye on the chat. And there's some questions coming in there.
Yes,
so.
there is a comment and 3 questions. The comment is similar to the one that was made by the colleague about how such a panel that's discussing the recognition of legitimate tenure rights failed to include anyone to address the challenges those faced by small-scale fisheries, who represent 90% of employment for the sector globally. That's the comment. And then the questions are more directed to FAO. How can FAO work with the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights or other relevant stakeholders in expedited processes and protocols to support the work of communities securing their land tenure? And same person, how can communities securing their land tenure work with FAO on recommendations or revisions to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda or other instruments that can link tenure to finance, access to finance? And finally, how can FAO support legal mechanisms to promote the fulfillment of the VGGTs, which is basically making them less voluntary?
All right, good. I think we'll try to get some answers from the panel first, and then we'll do one more round of questions. So maybe the panelists can also, well, help us in keeping their answers a bit short. I think, well, who wants to kick off with some answers? Chris, you want to start?
Thanks, Gemma, and thank you, Natasha, and also the colleague online who raised the issue around fisherfolk. And I think it's a problem, right? Which I think donors and others have often been guilty of not really thinking about or just looking at the groups that are immediately in front of them. And I think sometimes the data doesn't help, but that's not an excuse. So I think we do have our biases, and I think it's a timely reminder and challenge that we need to really work harder to make sure that we listen to all the different voices, particularly pastoralists, who I completely agree are often sort of left off entirely or at the end in a lot of conversations. And so I think, yeah, I don't think there's much else to say than yes, I think that's a really valid point. There is a global donor working group on land where donors meet regularly, and it is something that has come up from time to time, but it's not like we have a whole program of work, and that's probably what you kind of need to do in some way if you want to kind of address that bias. If I can speak on the microphone, I just want to add a question for the next round, so you don't have to come back to me, to Ramesh. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. And I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more when we get there in the second round on the proposals you were making about a ministerial forum for land reform. You mentioned 2026. It's just good to hear a bit more what specifically you have in mind and are referring to. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, for your response and your question. I think, Laura, there was a specific question for you, which you maybe want to address.
Yeah. Well, what I can bring here is simply the voice and the perspective of the open data community that we work very close with. My colleagues working on land issues, on the SDGs, they can certainly add and have much stronger arguments about indigenous peoples' communal land and how to track and measure, etc. Regarding disclosure of data, what I can say is simply that the open data definition has been amended. Is one of the reasons. This is specifically one of the reasons why the open data definition was amended, and the open data charter is not talking about open by default like it was referring to in the past, but open for a specific purpose, open data for a purpose, and they added into the discussions element of data ethic, data sovereignty, data privacy specifically because of these issues and the sensitivity of opening data that can harm certain communities. So yeah, certainly is a debate and a discussion. I don't have a solution myself. I'm just saying my point is simply encouraging conversations around data and bringing in different perspectives, because certainly many indigenous organizations are capable of collecting and documenting the land, and they also have they have the ability to bring in their stake. So they need to come to the conversations as a legitimate voices. So that's my only point.
Thank you, Laura. And Wart, there were a couple of quite big questions for you. Could you answer those in 2 minutes, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gemma, and thank you for these questions. I won't go into details in each one of these questions, but respond a bit more generically in relation to the global land agenda that we are promoting here. First of all, on the question of which land reforms and how to deal with the externalities of these land reforms, the aim of the global land agenda is not to push for one type of land reform or another. The aim of the global land agenda is to put land as a priority on the political agendas. And it is not for us, not for FAO, because the questions were raised for FAO, not for FAO, but for none of the partners in this initiative to say what land reform we should engage in, or which one we should not engage in, or which track we should follow or not. It is here to promote land and to support any track of land reform that is seen legitimate, politically anchored in these countries and implemented, of course, according and in the framework of good governance of the VGTs, etc. There are several proposals on the table at global level to accompany land or to push land high on the agenda. And I think all these modalities, all these various ways of pushing land have the right to exist, should exist, and I think should be promoted in the global land agenda. Whether they go for example, a summit, multi-stakeholderism or multilateralism, I don't think it matters. It is here the aim of keeping land high on the agenda because, as I said in my presentation, land is central, and if we do not address land, it will be tricky to address not only the land sector, but also all the other sectors that are directly or indirectly related to land, climate, etc. Secondly, on how would we work with UNHCR and other bodies? I think part of the VGTs, part of the global land agenda is to push for reform, to push for action in an inclusive way, whether that is at local level, whether that's at national level, whether that's at global level. And the global land agenda is trying to establish a multi-stakeholder platform or agenda or campaign, whatever we call it, that is inclusive of all these stakeholders, whether they are from the land sector and beyond. Ideally, of course, and that's what we're aiming for, including climate, peace, democracy, gender, etc., etc. Again, here, these collaborations are necessary, and they are necessary across the sectors, across the different type of actors, and within these different type of actors, across the agencies like FAO, like UNHCR, etc. It's only when all of us will work together that we will be able to push a land agenda that is seen as a solution for all these other sectors as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ward. I'm thinking I saw one, urgent question in the room. Please go ahead.
Je ne sais pas, je me présente Souad Mahmoud de la Tunisie, de la Marche mondiale des femmes, CSIPM. Moi, ça m'a attiré l'idée d'avoir un guide foncier par rapport à la réforme, tout ce qui est accès à la terre et à la possession. Moi, j'ai regardé le guide d'une manière générale, mais je trouve qu'il y a une région qui est totalement absente de par la législation qui existe et qui gère les propriétés foncières dans cette région. Mais je préfère bien parler au nom de la Tunisie. Nous, on fait partie de cette région qui est la région MENA. Et on sait très bien que c'est vrai par rapport à la notion de la propriété de la terre et la superficie et la subdivision de la terre, elle est plus, je confirme qu'elle est plus que 80%, elle est moins qu'un hectare. Reste que pour cet 1 hectare, la part des femmes, il est toujours avec une très basse pourcentage de possession pour les femmes. Et on sait très bien que la possession de la terre par rapport aux femmes, en Tunisie, je parle principalement, ça vient de l'héritage. L'héritage qui est encore géré par une loi qui se base sur la religion et non pas une loi civile. Par contre, le reste des lois qui gèrent tout ce qui se rapporte au code de statut personnel par rapport aux femmes, c'est des lois civiles, sauf malheureusement pour les Tunisiennes, c'est cette loi-là qui reste encore, qui est sur la base d'une législation religieuse, et donc elle donne la moitié pour la femme. Par contre, c'est le double pour les hommes, et ça c'est une discrimination et c'est une inégalité. Donc de quelle réforme peut-on parler si le guide ne parle pas d'une région dont elle exclut l'égalité et les droits humains par rapport aux femmes? Comment peut-on parler d'une réforme égalitaire et comment peut-on parler de la démocratie? Ça, je crois que si le guide ne prend pas en conséquence les spécificités des régions, moi j'ai bien parlé de la Tunisie parce que je connais très bien, et c'est une revendication du mouvement féministe pour avoir l'égalité dans l'héritage, mais je sais très bien que de par cette région, il y en a d'autres régions qui sont dans l'Afrique dont elles sont interdites d'hériter la terre, elles sont interdites d'avoir une possession de la terre. Donc le guide qui serait fourni par une organisation onisienne, comment il peut, s'il ne traite pas de ces spécificités par rapport pour avoir une poussée, pour donner un plus pour que la société civile dans ces régions-là puisse travailler et puisse avancer, je crois que ça manque un peu, parce que la démocratie sans égalité, je ne crois pas à cette démocratie-là. Merci.
Thank you for your intervention, and I think Ramesh wants to respond to that, and also you had a question from Chris still, so maybe I'll just you go ahead, Ramesh. Take the floor.
Thank you. So first, coming to your question, Chris, I mean, on behalf of Forum for Land Struggle, I would say, and 3 of my colleagues are also here. So I would say that we are the strong believers of that land rights is a human rights for all those people who are yet to wait for their land rights, and they are waiting for since generations. So the 4 very specific proposals, they could be a long wish list, but just I'm taking only 4 points here. I mean, we are living in a world where there is an interesting framework of guarantee, health, education, information, this and that. What about the land? So can we think of a new way of land redistribution, especially addressing the question of the growing landless and homeless population and invisible group? As you said, there are many invisible groups, and understanding the potential of land guarantee legislation for the future. The second very specific point from my side is to definitely recognize and protect the family farming. As I said, that this is the only answer for addressing the climate crisis, which actually impacting almost like a 2/3 of the vulnerable population in the world. The third specific point is to, as my sister mentioned, that to recognize the women land rights, it's a generational question. I mean, we can accuse the social resistance and all other forms of resistance, but where are the political commitments? If we really want to translate SDG 5 into the action, we talk about the legal framework, but where are the legal frameworks? So my third proposition is to understand the potential for women land rights. And final one, which is for me, being a part of the land movement and being a representative of the struggle of land forum, to respect and recognize the land and the farmers movement. Because we are living in a world where whosoever the land activist is raising the voice, they are facing a lot of reverse challenges and adverse challenges. Several of them, they are in the jail. Several of them, they were killed. So until there is no respect for this constructive opposition of the land movement, it's very difficult to understand the world for tomorrow. So that's my brief answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh, for coming back to that and for bringing that into the discussion. I see some more hands. Just one. Do you have a brief question? No. Then maybe we have to follow up after the session. Would that be okay? Okay. Good. I think, yeah, we have to close the session actually, because we're already 5 minutes over time. But I think this was a really interesting discussion amongst all of us. From the questions that came up, I could hear indeed, as Wart also mentioned, that we have quite some people in the audience that are, well, part of the land community, as we would call it. But also online, we had a very nice participation. I see 51 people online. So, well, hopefully we managed to get some new people on board as well. Yeah, this session was really meant to emphasize that the global land agenda and the putting land higher on the international agenda, but also on the national, local agendas is a great priority at this moment. And if we want to reach SDGs and if we want to move forward with applying the voluntary guidelines on tenure. So thank you all for the well, questions and for your contributions, and we'll close it with this. Thanks.
Thank you. Well done.